"Get out, you filthy repairman! Who do you think you are to dare touch the CEO's daughter?" The shout exploded across the lavish charity gala just as Marcus Jackson knelt in front of a deaf little girl, his hands still smeared with grease and oil. Security closed in. The so-called expert doctor standing nearby curled his lips in contempt. In that room, a single breath taken out of rhythm was enough for Marcus to be thrown out like a threat. Who was he? A poor black man, a plumbing and electrical repairman, someone who was not allowed to cross the line. And standing before him was the daughter of the most powerful CEO in the room, abandoned amid a sea of elegance like a silent, decorative object. But then, just a few seconds later, one exact moment, Marcus did not argue, did not beg, did not explain. He raised both hands and signed a greeting in sign language. The little girl froze. Then her eyes lit up. A smile broke free, small, trembling, but real, and the entire room fell silent. Because for the first time that evening, the child was being spoken with, not spoken about, and the truth landed like a slap across the face of the elite. Marcus was not a troublemaker. He was a single father who had taught himself American Sign Language to become the ears for his own son. So the question is this: if you were Marcus, would you bow your head before power, or stand up so that a child would no longer be invisible? Who was the real danger in that room? Follow the channel and comment, "I stand with the child," because right after this, they will pay the price for daring to call humanity a threat. The house where Marcus Jackson lived with his son sat tucked away in the middle of an aging working-class neighborhood, a place where the walls were stained and peeling and electrical wires tangled overhead as if they had never been properly repaired. At night, the lights inside the house often flickered, not because of power outages, but because the system was simply too old, much like the lives of the people who lived there. Marcus was used to it. He was used to lowering his head, used to fixing things others had abandoned, used to existing on the margins of society where no one truly bothered to look. Marcus was a black man, a widower, making a living as an electrical and plumbing repairman. His work took him through dilapidated apartments, damp basements, and places that wealthy people only noticed on a map when they needed to avoid them. His wife had died from a severe illness several years earlier, leaving him alone with their young son, Liam. That illness had not only taken away the woman Marcus loved but had also left lasting consequences for Liam. The boy lost his hearing very early in life, and his world passed by in a dense silence that Marcus was forced to learn how to enter. That night, Marcus knelt on the floor, one hand gripping a screwdriver, the other tightening an old electrical outlet that had been sparking repeatedly all week. The flickering light reflected off a face hollowed out by lack of sleep. He frowned in concentration, then suddenly felt a gaze fixed on him. Liam sat on a chair, hugging an old teddy bear, watching his father with familiar eyes that carried both curiosity and worry. Marcus turned around, set his tools down, and raised both hands, signing slowly, "Dad is here, don't be afraid." Liam followed every movement carefully, then replied with his small hands, still clumsy, but trying very hard, "Is the outlet okay?" Marcus smiled faintly and nodded. "It's fine. Dad fixed it." Liam hesitated for a moment, then signed again. "Can I go to school, like the other kids?" The question was not new, but every time it made Marcus pause. He looked at his son, looked at his own hands, then signed more slowly and carefully, as if one wrong movement might be enough to shatter the fragile hope in the boy's eyes. "Dad will find a way, I promise." In this neighborhood, promises did not carry much value, but Marcus still said it. He knew Liam needed to hear it, even if only as something to hold on to. Out in the hallway, a neighbor's voice rang out, not lowered at all. "You should send him to a center. A poor guy teaching a deaf kid. That sounds ridiculous." Marcus stood up and stepped to the door. His voice was not loud, but it was hard and sharp. "Don't call my son mute." The other man shrugged and smirked, as if Marcus had overreacted. Around here, people were used to saying things like that, so used to it that they no longer thought of it as an insult. The next morning, Marcus stopped by an electrical and plumbing supply store near the neighborhood. He placed the items he needed on the counter and felt the clerk's eyes slide from his face down to his worn shoes, then pause on the bag hanging at his side. The man behind the counter tapped his fingers. "Open the bag. Store policy. Marcus stood still for a few seconds, then did as told. He did not want to argue. Arguments like that rarely ended with anyone winning. After the inspection was finished, Marcus spoke, his voice low but clear. "I'm here to buy things, not to beg. It's done." The clerk did not respond, only shoved the receipt across the counter. Marcus took it, turned away, and left with the familiar feeling of suspicion clinging tightly to his back. That evening, after Liam had finished eating and was sitting at the table scribbling drawings, Marcus stood in front of the cracked mirror in the corner of the house. He raised his hands and practiced the American Sign Language signs he had learned. His hands were rough from labor, moving more slowly than the books described, but every motion was repeated with relentless patience. Sweat dotted his forehead. His arms ached, yet Marcus kept going. He whispered, speaking and signing at the same time. "Liam, Dad will be your world." As Kreese, Liam saw him, smiled softly, then signed back awkwardly, "I know." Night fell, and the house grew quieter. Liam slept soundly on the small bed, pushed against the wall. Marcus sat beside him, memories of his wife quietly flooding back. She had once sat in this exact spot, her thin hand resting on his, her eyes filled with worry for the child who had not yet been born, but was already destined to bear the consequences of illness. Marcus lowered his head and whispered as if speaking to the dead, "I promised. I won't let our child disappear into silence." The phone vibrated, breaking the stillness. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. Marcus hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was cold and quick, stripped of emotion. "Are you Marcus Jackson? There's an urgent job, fixing the lighting system, a large-scale gala." Marcus asked for details, then cautiously asked about the pay. The voice on the other end laughed, barely hiding its contempt. "You think you get to negotiate? Do it, or get lost. There are plenty of people waiting." Marcus hung up and sat still for a long time. He looked at Liam sleeping, then at his own hands, hands that had been dismissed as ordinary repairman's hands, hands that had been searched like suspicious objects, hands that were seen as belonging nowhere near elegant places. He understood very well the kinds of spaces the caller had mentioned. At a gala like that, standing in the wrong spot, saying the wrong thing, or even breathing at the wrong rhythm, could turn him into a troublemaker in someone else's eyes. Marcus stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the darkened street. Part of him wanted to refuse, to choose the familiar safety he knew. But then he thought of bills, of medicine, of Liam's question about school. He turned back, looked at his son once more, then picked up the phone and called back. "Where's the address?" The voice answered immediately, as if it had been waiting. Marcus memorized it and hung up. He nodded to himself, a decision that seemed small, yet would pull him into an entirely different world. Marcus did not know that that night, that single nod would set off a chain of events that would ensure his and Liam's lives would never be the same again. Marcus prepared his tools in silence. He checked each item again, not because he feared something might be missing, but because it was the only way to keep his mind from drifting toward other thoughts. Liam stood at the doorway, watching his father with worry he could not hide. Marcus turned back, raised his hand, and signed slowly and clearly, as if every movement needed to be carved into memory. "Dad is going to work. You stay home. Lock the door." End quote. Liam stepped closer and lightly tugged at Marcus's sleeve. The boy's eyes lingered on his father's face, then his hands moved faster than usual. "Dad, don't let them hurt you." Marcus froze. He bent down to meet his son at eye level and signed back with firmer, more decisive motions. "I know. I will come back." This time, the promise did not come with a smile. Marcus understood clearly that the place he was heading to was nothing like the repair sites he was used to. It was a space where he was not welcome, even though he had been summoned. On the way there, the city gradually changed. Rows of old, squat houses gave way to towering glass buildings, their lights stretching out Leah's another city, layered on top of the old one. When the car stopped in front of the gala venue, Marcus looked up. The building blazed with light, illumination spilling from every side and reflecting off the slick pavement. He muttered, almost to himself, "The money here could buy medicine for my whole neighborhood." Marcus slung his tool bag over his shoulder and walked toward the main gate. Before he could even present his papers, a security guard raised a hand to block him. The man's eyes swept Marcus from head to toe, lingering a bit too long on the bag at his side. "This entrance is for guests. The back way is for workers." Marcus pulled out the job confirmation and held it out. "I was called to fix the lighting system." The guard took the paper, glanced at it half-heartedly, then smirked. "Fix what? Don't tell me you came here just to take a look. Plenty of people like to do that tonight." Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his voice low but steady. "Someone called me. I'm here to work." The guard did not answer right away. He stepped closer and slapped Marcus's chest hard, as if checking a crate of goods. The blow was not strong enough to hurt, but it was enough to humiliate. He spoke loudly, deliberately making sure people around could hear. "Anything dangerous in that bag? Or are you hiding something in there?" Marcus tightened his grip on the strap, his jaw clenched. "I came to work, not to beg." A few heads turned. Some people frowned, others looked entertained. The guard snorted, handed the paper back, and pointed toward a side path along the building. "Go that way." In 12 Enterdas, Marcus turned his back and walked in the direction indicated. As he passed, a member of the organizing committee stepped out from the lobby. The man glanced at Marcus, his gaze pausing briefly, as if he had spotted something filthy on the floor. His voice was flat, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Don't let him stand near the VIP guests. The smell of grease pollutes the air." Marcus did not turn around. He kept walking, each step heavier than the last, the familiar weight of class division pressing down on his shoulders. Here, everything was clearly separated. Who entered through the front door? Who went in through the back? Who was called a guest? Who was called a worker? No signs were needed. Every look was enough to define his place. The back entrance was narrower and darker, leading straight into the technical area. Another staff member guided Marcus inside without much talk. "The main lighting system is in the grand hall. Do it quickly, then leave." Marcus nodded. He did not expect further explanation or courtesy. When the door leading into the hall opened, sound rushed in before the light. Music throbbed insistently, laughter and chatter overlapping, blending into a constant wave. Crystal lights from the ceiling poured down, so bright that Marcus had to squint. He stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. No one looked directly at him, yet every glance that passed over him was enough to determine where he belonged. Marcus lowered his head and followed the edge of the room, searching for the lighting system. In a corner of the hall, he set his tool bag down and began checking the wiring, a habit ingrained deep into his body. As he worked, Marcus caught fragments of conversation. "This year's charity event is really big. What matters is how good it looks in the press. The Harlan family always knows how to make an impression." The words drifted past him, without leaving much of a trace, until his eyes accidentally settled on another corner of the room. Amid the sea of elegantly dressed guests, a small chair sat slightly apart from the circle of conversation. On it, a child sat quietly, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes following the movements of people's lips around her, with no one responding. No adult bent down to speak to her, and no one waited for her reply. She was present, yet it was as if she had been pushed out of the room's current. Marcus stopped working for a brief moment. The scene pulled him back to the rare parent meetings for Liam, where his son sat watching classmates laugh and talk, while no one thought about communicating with him. The feeling was painfully familiar. He turned away, reminding himself to focus on the job. He was here to fix the lights, not to draw attention. But his gaze drifted back to the child once more. The girl was still sitting there, her eyes widening when she noticed Marcus, perhaps because, for the first time in that room, someone was not pretending she did not exist. Marcus bent down again, his hand gripping his tools tightly, Liam's voice echoing in his mind from earlier. "Dad, don't let them hurt you." Marcus knew that one wrong step would make him the problem. Yet in that very moment, he also understood that from the instant he stepped through that back door, he had been standing on the edge of something far greater than a simple repair job. He lowered his head and returned to his work, his heart beating faster than usual. The lights in the hall continued to blaze, laughter still rang out, but within that lavish space, Marcus clearly saw an emptiness, where a child sat alone, as if erased from the world around her. And he had no idea that in just a few minutes, that very emptiness would pull him out of the corner of the room and thrust him into the center of a storm that no one in that hall was ready to face. Marcus knelt beneath the lighting system in the corner of the hall, his head slightly bowed, his hands tightening a loosened screw. The electrical current stabilized again. The light above flickered less, but the laughter behind him still wavered, slick and unstable like a layer of oil spread across the floor. Stories wove into one another, smooth, polite, full of implication, yet the more one listened, the hollower they sounded. A man spoke loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. It's charity, after all, as long as it looks good in the papers. Who remembers where the money actually goes? Laughter burst out, light and confident, as if kindness were a piece of jewelry that could be taken off and put away. Marcus kept working. He was used to being background, used to other people's stories, passing by his ears and drifting away without sticking. But his gaze suddenly paused when he noticed a pocket of stillness in the room. At the edge of a circle of conversation, a chair sat slightly askew, and on it sat a small girl, perfectly still, Sophia. The child did not look up at the ceiling lights, nor did she look at Marcus. Sophia's eyes moved slowly along the lips of those who were speaking, as if she were trying to read a language the room had no intention of translating for her. No one bent down, no one waited for a response. Sophia existed in the way an object does when it is placed correctly, enough to complete the picture, but not enough to be considered the center of anyone's attention. A woman approached, bent down, and adjusted Sophia's dress. The movement was neat and decisive, like smoothing a crease on a banquet tablecloth. "Sit still! Don't embarrass your mother." The voice was neither loud nor sharp, but it carried a familiar command. Sophia blinked, her back straightened a little, her hands pressed closer to her thighs, her gaze emptying by a single beat. Marcus watched the scene and felt something familiar surge in his chest. The image of Liam came into sharp focus. Those rare meetings at the old school, where his son sat watching other children laugh and talk, while no one thought to slow down, turn toward him, or learn a single gesture to communicate with the boy. That feeling of being left behind, Marcus had seen it too many times to mistake it. He lowered his head back to his work, but his ears still caught fragments of conversation. Near the central banquet table, a white man stood upright, carrying the air of someone accustomed to being listened to. It was Graves. He spoke in an even, confident voice, as though reading out a conclusion already stamped and approved. "The child's condition is almost hopeless. The family has done everything they possibly can." Someone else sighed softly. "How pitiful." And then, immediately after, another comment, light as air. "But, well, at least the Harlan family is willing to spend." Graves offered a thin smile and took a sip of water. "Whatever it costs is worth it, as long as they listen to me." Those words fell to the floor like cold coins. No one asked what Sophia thought. No one asked what the child wanted. Everything revolved around what the adults had decided was best, most convenient, most presentable for their image. Marcus looked up. His gaze darkened. He muttered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "Hopeless, my ass. People just can't be bothered to learn her language." The remark was not aimed at anyone in particular, but it made Marcus remain still for another second. He realized he was looking at Sophia longer than necessary. The child turned her head ever so slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was no excessive curiosity, no fear, just a direct look, as if Sophia were accustomed to searching for the smallest sign that someone truly saw her. Marcus set his tools down. He knew exactly what he was about to do. He also knew exactly the price he might have to pay. In a place like this, boundaries did not need to be spoken aloud. They existed in glances, in how people addressed one another, in who was allowed to stand where, and who was meant to disappear into the corner of the room. A black repairman stepping away from his post and approaching the daughter of a chief executive officer was not an expected act. Marcus stood up. He walked slowly, not in a hurry, but without hesitation. Each step was a crossing. No one stopped him, but several pairs of eyes turned to follow. Some people frowned, others tilted their heads with curiosity, as if waiting to see what mistake he would make. When Marcus came closer, Sophia tilted her head slightly, her eyes widening. He knelt so their lines of sight were level. The distance was close enough for Sophia to see his face clearly, close enough for those around them to begin paying attention. Marcus did not touch the child. He simply raised both hands, slowly, carefully, as if entering a space that demanded absolute respect. At that moment, Graves turned his head. His eyes caught the scene before him and darkened immediately. It was not the look of someone worried about a child, but the look of a man who had discovered a flaw in an order he believed he controlled. He set his glass down and stepped half a pace forward, his lips pressed tight. Marcus did not look at Graves. All his attention was focused on Sophia. He began to sign, his hands moving slowly and clearly. "Hello?" Sophia froze for a brief moment. Then, her small hands twitched, hesitant, as if testing whether this was real or just another game adults played. Finally, she responded, a small gesture, incomplete, but enough to make Marcus's heart tighten. Around them, conversation thinned. A few people began to whisper, "What is he doing? Who gave him permission? Someone should intervene." Graves stepped forward another pace, his voice low but sharp. "What are you doing?" Marcus still did not turn around. He continued signing to Sophia, simple, gentle, the way he always did with Liam at home. "What is your name?" Sophia parted her lips, then signed, "Sophia." In that moment, the room seemed to stall, not because of magic, but because the truth had been exposed too plainly. The child was not hopeless at all. She simply needed someone to speak to her in her own language. Graves drew in a deep breath, struggling to maintain his composure. "Stop." His voice hardened. "You are causing interference. This is a medical matter." Marcus lifted his head, for the first time looking directly at Graves. "This is a human being." A few quiet gasps rippled through the room. From a distance, someone whispered, carrying carefully packaged contempt, "That child isn't normal." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and cold. Sophia did not hear it, but she saw the reaction on Marcus's face. He turned back to her, his gaze softening, his hands remaining poised, ready to continue signing. Behind him, Graves clenched his jaw. He understood better than anyone what was happening. Just a few more seconds, and the control he had built with files, with terminology, with cold judgments, would begin to crack. Marcus leaned closer, raising his hands again, preparing the next sign. Sophia followed every movement, her eyes brightening slightly, like someone who had just found a narrow opening through which to breathe. And it was in that very moment that Graves decided the man in front of him had become a disaster. If you have ever witnessed a child being ignored simply because they were different, do not scroll past. Follow the channel and comment, "I stand with the child," because in the very next second, they will turn Marcus into a monster, simply because he dared to speak with Sophia. Marcus remained kneeling in front of Sophia, keeping just enough distance so as not to frighten the child. The murmuring behind his back had begun to spread, but he did not turn around. All of Marcus's attention was fixed on the eyes before him, eyes accustomed to watching other people's lips move, yet rarely receiving a response meant solely for herself. He raised both hands, slowly, every movement deliberate and clear, as if everything around them had vanished. "Hi, I'm Marcus." His top two. It was not a long sentence, nor was it anything profound, but to Sophia, that movement carried an entirely different meaning. She flinched ever so slightly, her shoulders tensing by reflex, then her eyes widened. Sophia stared intently at Marcus's hands, following every detail, as if confirming that this was not a joke. After a few seconds of hesitation, her small hands lifted. The movement was still clumsy, not yet smooth, but unmistakably clear and intentional. "Hello." A very soft sound slipped from Sophia's throat, not fully formed, not evenly paced, but the smile came immediately afterward, quick and bright, so much so that Marcus had to hold his breath for a brief beat. Her face changed visibly, as if an invisible switch had just been flipped after many years buried in darkness. A few people nearby paused, their gazes lingering on the scene longer than usual. Marcus continued signing, slow and steady. "What's your name?" Sophia tilted her head, her eyes wavering slightly, then replied, "Sophia." This time, her hands were firmer, with less hesitation. Marcus nodded and smiled a very small nod, but enough for Sophia to understand that her answer had been received. Marcus took a deep breath, then signed another sentence he had signed for Liam countless times before, "You are not invisible." Sophia froze. Her hands stopped in midair. Her eyes flickered, as if those words had touched somewhere very deep, somewhere she had never had a name for. Then her lips curved upward again, this smile slower, shakier, but unmistakably real. She let out a short laugh, uneven, imperfect by the standards of rooms like this, yet the most vivid laugh in the ballroom at that moment. The music seemed to soften, or perhaps it was because the people around them had begun to pay attention. A group of nearby guests stopped laughing. Several heads turned toward Marcus and Sophia. Someone whispered, unable to hide their irritation, "What is he doing?" Another replied in a tone half curious, half wary, "Who allowed this?" Marcus turned his head, sweeping his gaze across the room. His eyes were not fierce, but they were direct and clear. He spoke, not loudly, yet loudly enough for the nearest people to hear. "You're all so rich, and not one of you can be bothered to learn a single greeting." The sentence fell into the hall like a heavy object. No one immediately argued back. A few people shifted, their eyes sliding away. Someone tightened their grip on a glass. Someone else pressed their lips together. Marcus turned back to Sophia without waiting for a reaction. He signed another simple sentence, asking whether she was happy. Sophia nodded vigorously, the motion much larger than before, then smiled once more. That very moment exposed the collective cruelty of the room, not because anyone shouted or lost their temper, but because the discomfort spread so quickly. People accustomed to controlling a space through status and gaze suddenly felt the familiar order punctured by something far too simple. A repairman knelt, speaking to a child in her own language, and the room no longer knew how to respond. Sophia turned to look at Marcus, her hands already ready to sign again. She was in a rare moment, one in which communication was no longer a one-sided effort. But just as her hands lifted, a shadow moved forward. Graves stepped out from the crowd, his face tightening, his voice sharp and cold. "Stop!" The sound cut through the air like a blade. A few people exhaled in relief, as if someone had finally restored order. Marcus looked up, still kneeling, his gaze meeting Graves's directly. "You are agitating the patient," Graves continued, each word emphasized, carrying the weight of a professional judgment. Marcus did not stand. He glanced at Sophia for a brief second, then looked back at Graves. "Patient?" His voice was low and steady. "She's a human being." A few scattered gasps were heard. Graves stepped closer, bending down near Marcus, close enough for only the two of them to hear. A faint scent of cologne. His voice lowered but no less venomous. "What would a black repairman know? Leave now, before you're considered a threat." Marcus did not retreat. He did not respond immediately either. He turned back to Sophia, his eyes softening, his hands still poised. Sophia looked over Marcus's shoulder, saw Graves, and saw the unfamiliar faces waiting for a decision. The smile on her lips slowed, but the light in her eyes remained. Marcus turned to face Graves again. "You call greeting a child a threat?" Graves straightened, his voice louder now, enough for those nearby to hear. "You have no right to be here. This is a medical matter, not a place for cheap emotional displays." Marcus replied without raising his voice. "Medicine does not have the right to erase a human being from the conversation." Someone standing close by whispered, half in defense, half in warning, "Please, don't make things complicated. Ezive." Marcus glanced at that person, then turned back to Sophia. He signed quickly, just enough for her to understand. "Dad is here." Sophia watched him, her hands trembling slightly. She began to sign again, but her movement slowed when she saw Graves raise a hand, signaling security in the distance. No one moved in immediately, but the message had been sent. The room was now completely silent. There was no more laughter, no clearly audible music. Every gaze converged on the center, where one man knelt before a child and another stood in the name of expertise, ready to reclaim control. Marcus held his position. He knew exactly what was coming, but in that moment, he also knew that the greeting just spoken could not be taken back. It had been said, seen, and answered. And for Sophia, that was enough to change the way she saw this room. Graves narrowed his eyes, his voice dropping once more, sharp enough to kill the fragile atmosphere that had just appeared. "I'm warning you for the last time. Leave now, before everything gets out of control." Marcus looked at him, then at Sophia. He did not stand up right away. He waited, as if giving the room one more second to ask itself what it had just witnessed. And it was that very waiting that made those around him even more unsettled, because they understood that the familiar order had begun to shake simply because of a greeting that seemed, on the surface, harmless. The fragile moment that had just appeared in the room had not even had time to settle before it was crushed. Graves turned around very quickly, his gaze sweeping past Marcus as if he were looking at a technical flaw that needed to be handled immediately. He moved toward the event organizers, his voice dropping low, but still clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Who allowed him to approach Sophia? This is a serious security lapse." One of the organizers frowned, followed the direction Graves pointed, then jerked his chin toward security. "That's right. Call security. Don't let outsiders overstep. If this gets into the press, who's going to take responsibility?" The atmosphere in the hall changed noticeably. The curious looks from moments ago turned cautious. Some people stepped back half a step, as if afraid of being implicated. Marcus sensed that shift immediately. He slowly stood up, took half a step toward Sophia, just enough to block Graves's direct line of sight to the child. "I was just greeting her," Marcus said, his voice steady, not raised. Graves laughed with a thin and cold smile. "Greeting," he emphasized the word, then tilted his head. "Or are you luring a patient? Do you understand what you just did?" The question did not need an answer. It was posed to assign a label. Marcus looked straight at Graves. "I talked to her." "Agat." A nearby VIP cut in, his tone half joking, half contemptuous. "Typical bottom feeders, always clinging whenever there's a chance. You see them everywhere." A few small laughs rippled out, quick and contained, like nods of agreement. Marcus did not turn around. He bent down slightly, so Sophia could see him more clearly. The child trembled, her hands signing hurriedly. "Don't go." Marcus responded immediately, his movements decisive so Sophia could understand in time. "Dad understands, but you are safe." That sign was not an empty reassurance. It was a promise within Marcus's ability, even though he knew he was standing in a far weaker position. Sophia looked at him, eyes wide, then turned to look at Graves as he stepped closer. Graves raised his hand, grabbed Sophia's wrist, pulling gently but firmly, just enough to separate her from Marcus's line of sight. His voice rang out, even and cold, like a sentence already written. "Sophia, look at me. Don't let distractions make you unstable." Sophia froze. Her hands stopped mid-air. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus one last time, confused and frightened. Marcus clenched his fist. He looked up, his voice lower. "You don't heal. You just command." Graves turned back, his gaze sharp and thin like a blade. "And you are just a repairman." He paused for a beat, then continued, each word falling very slowly. "Your place is the corner of the room, not in front of the CEO's daughter." Is another. Those words were not aimed only at Marcus. They were spoken for the entire room to hear, a reminder of order, of boundaries, of who was allowed to stand, where. Marcus remained still, his back straight, his eyes never leaving Sophia. He knew that if he stepped back now, the child would disappear from him once again, in exactly the way this room was accustomed to. Footsteps sounded from the entrance of the hall, steady and decisive. The sound of heels striking the stone floor made many people turn their heads. A small gap opened in the crowd, and then Victoria Harlan appeared. She walked in as if the room belonged to her, her eyes sweeping quickly over everything, stopping right at the center of the chaos that had just been created. Graves immediately changed his tone, lowering it, more deferential. "Miss Victoria, we are handling an incident." This man approached Sophia without authorization. Victoria looked at Marcus. That look held no curiosity or concern, but a cold assessment, like looking at a stain on an expensive carpet. "Who are you to dare touch my child?" The question was spoken lightly, but it carried the weight of power. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, waiting for his reaction. Some were already prepared to see him dragged away, as an inevitable part of restoring order. Marcus took a deep breath. He knew exactly who he was standing before, a CEO accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. But when he spoke, his voice was frighteningly calm. "The only person here who knows how to talk to your child." A few murmurs slipped out, then died immediately. Victoria narrowed her eyes slightly. She glanced at Sophia, seeing the child standing still, her hands hanging down, her gaze wavering. She turned back to Marcus, this time for longer. "What did you say?" Marcus did not repeat himself. He simply looked at Sophia, then at Victoria. "Your child does not need another person talking about her. She needs someone to talk to her." Graves cut in immediately, his voice more urgent. "Miss Victoria, he is overstepping. This is a medical matter. We cannot allow uncontrolled factors to affect Sophia's condition." Victoria raised a hand, signaling Graves to be silent. She took another step toward Marcus. The distance between them was now close enough to make those around them hold their breath. "In what capacity are you here?" Marcus answered at once. "I was called in to fix the lighting system." A few people chuckled softly. Victoria did not smile. "Then do your job. Stay away from my daughter." Marcus looked straight at her. "I did my job. I fixed the lights, and I greeted your daughter." The tension thickened. Victoria remained silent for a few seconds. In that pause, Sophia looked at her mother, then at Marcus. The child's hands trembled slightly, as if she wanted to sign something, but stopped when she noticed Graves's eyes tracking every movement. Victoria turned to Graves. "What is this about?" Graves quickly regained control. "Just a misunderstanding. This man seems not to understand boundaries. I made it clear to him." Marcus cut in. "You made it clear that your daughter is a hopeless patient." Graves spun around. "Shut up." Victoria looked at Graves, then at Sophia, then back at Marcus. She did not make a decision immediately, but the room understood very well what was coming. Here, everything was always resolved through power, through removing what was inconvenient. Victoria took a deep breath. "Where is security?" A faint radio crackle sounded from afar. Marcus remained still, neither stepping back nor forward. He looked at Sophia one last time, his gaze enough for the child to understand that he was still there. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see which way the powerful woman would choose to handle it, and how the price of a single greeting would be calculated. Victoria Harlan stood in the middle of the hall, her posture straight and motionless, her gaze locked onto Marcus. She did not ask another question, nor did she look at her daughter even one more time. When she spoke, her voice was decisive and cold enough to sever every trace of warmth that had just existed in the room. "Stay away from my daughter." Immediately, the words fell, concise and sharp. Marcus looked at Sophia, then at Victoria. He pointed toward the child, his voice low but clear. "Didn't you hear it? Your daughter just smiled, for the first time tonight." A few people nearby shifted slightly. Some turned their faces away, others frowned. Graves immediately stepped half a pace forward, inserting himself between them, his voice dropping into his familiar professional tone. "Ms. Victoria, I'm afraid this individual has an agenda. He is forming an inappropriate connection. That is extremely dangerous for Sophia's condition." Inevitably, Marcus turned to Graves, his gaze sharper than before. "You call a greeting an agenda? Or are you afraid the child might have a voice?" Graves faltered for a brief moment, then quickly regained his composure. "You are speculating. I am protecting the patient." Victoria did not turn to look at Graves. She stared straight at Marcus, her eyes unwavering. Protecting. Just one word. Short, clear, like a stamp pressed down on the fate of someone already assigned to a position marked for removal. Two security guards at the edge of the hall immediately moved forward. Their footsteps were steady and heavy, forming a cold rhythm in the silence, spreading outward. Marcus did not step back. When a hand landed on his arm, he turned his head, his voice low but firm. "I'll leave when I'm finished." One guard tightened his grip. "You're finished." End quote. A faint laugh burst out from somewhere in the crowd. A guest curled his lips, speaking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "That's right. Throw him out. This isn't a place for poor people to put on a show." Those words were met with a few discreet nods. The familiar order was being restored. Marcus clearly felt the pull from behind, but he still tried to twist around to look at Sophia. The child was panicking, both hands signing continuously, movements fast and tangled. Don't. Idnotsuno." No one in the room responded. Some people looked, but their eyes slid over those movements, as if sliding past a sound that did not exist. Victoria turned to her daughter, her voice higher, filled with restrained irritation. "Sophia, stop it. You're embarrassing me." That sentence made Sophia freeze for a very brief beat. Her hands slowed, her gaze wavering between her mother and Marcus. Marcus was yanked harder, his footing slipping. He looked back, struggling to hold Sophia's gaze, his hands lifting quickly, forming the familiar sign. "You are not invisible." That was the last sentence Sophia received from Marcus. She watched him, her lips trembling, her hands trembling as if trying to respond. But then, the movement stopped entirely. Her hands lowered, resting on her thighs. Sophia's eyes remained open, but the light in them changed. There was no more panic and no more waiting. Marcus was dragged through the crowd. Faces parted to make way, then closed again immediately after he passed. Some looked at him with annoyance, some with curiosity, some with satisfaction that order had been re-established. The guards pushed him out of the center of the hall, toward the back door. Graves let out a light breath, very soft, as if he had just completed a complex procedure. He turned to Victoria. "I will adjust the treatment protocol." Perhaps the child was overstimulated. It's just a bow. Victoria nodded, her gaze still fixed on Sophia. She stepped closer to her daughter and bent down. It's all right. Everything has been handled. Sophia did not look at her mother. She looked toward the door, where Marcus had just been dragged away. The door closed, a decisive sound echoing through the hall. The music was turned back on, at first soft and hesitant, then gradually louder, like an attempt to cover the void that had just appeared. A few people returned to the banquet tables, continuing their unfinished conversations. What a nuisance. Good thing it was handled in time. It's nothing serious. Those remarks drifted by, smooth and familiar. Victoria straightened up. She looked at Sophia, then at Graves. Take her back to her room. Graves nodded, signaling to an assistant. Sophia was led away, her steps slow and even. She did not resist, nor did she sign anything else. That put Graves at ease. He told himself the reaction had passed, that the system had regained control. In the corridor leading to the back, Marcus was shoved once more before being released. "Go," one guard said bluntly, "and don't come back." Marcus stood still for a second, then adjusted the strap of his bag. He said nothing more. When he stepped outside, the door closed behind him, separating him from the lights, the music, and the faces from moments ago. The corridor was darker, colder, and silent in a very different way. Inside the hall, Victoria stood watching in the direction Sophia had gone. She felt that something was wrong, but could not name it. Graves stood beside her, continuing to explain in a confident voice. "You did the right thing. Sometimes it's necessary to cut out disruptive factors to protect the process." Victoria did not respond immediately. She turned to look at her daughter one last time before the door to the room closed. Sophia stood in the middle of the room, her back straight, her gaze no longer wavering. Her hands rested still, not moving. Graves observed the scene, then smiled very faintly. To him, this silence was a familiar sign that the system had won. Victoria stood frozen, a sense of emptiness spreading through her, though she did not yet understand why. Sophia sat down in the chair. She stared into the space in front of her, where Marcus's hands had been moving moments before. Her gaze did not weaken. It grew colder, sharper, carrying a silent decision. The entire room believed that Sophia was tired, that what had just happened was merely an overload. Graves believed he had preserved order. Victoria believed the situation was under control. But in that moment, Sophia had chosen. She chose silence. Not because her condition had worsened, but because it was resistance. If you want to see what price they will pay when a child is pushed so far that she must mute herself to fight against the entire world, follow and comment. Silence is not surrender. Because, in the next part, Sophia will use that very silence to shatter an entire fake humanitarian empire. Sophia's room was spacious, bright, and perfectly decorated according to the standards of a powerful household. The lighting was soft, the curtains thick, everything arranged to create a sense of safety. But to Sophia, the room felt like a box lined with velvet. She sat on the bed, her back resting against the headboard, her eyes fixed on the empty wall in front of her. Her hands lay on her thighs, unnaturally still, as if she had just been taught that any movement at this moment would be wrong. Outside, footsteps echoed and then stopped in front of the door. Victoria Harlan entered and closed the door behind her. She looked at her daughter, her eyes carrying a fatigue that had been suppressed all night. Victoria walked closer, sat down on the edge of the bed, and tried to recall the signs she had once learned in a cursory way. Her hands moved slowly, uncertainly. "Sophia, talk to me." Sophia did not turn her head. Her gaze remained fixed on the wall, as if there were something there more worthy of attention than all the adults in this room. Her hands stayed still, offering no response. Victoria waited a few more seconds, then exhaled. She turned her head when she heard the door open. Graves walked in, carrying his familiar calm demeanor. He stood near the table, glanced at Sophia, then looked at Victoria. His voice was even, carrying the certainty of someone accustomed to being trusted. This is a negative sign. Defiant children often use silence to manipulate their surroundings. Victoria frowned. "You mean she's doing this on purpose?" Graves nodded very slightly, as if confirming something obvious. "Yes, and the more you respond, the worse it becomes. Emotional reactions from adults reinforce this behavior." Sophia glanced at Graves. It was only a very quick look, but but it revealed something he did not see. Her eyes were cold and alert, without the panic or confusion of a child who had lost control. She looked at Graves the way one looks at someone speaking the wrong language, then turned back to the wall. Victoria lightly clasped her hands together. "What do you want?" she asked, this time more directly, with less indirection. Sophia did not answer. The silence stretched on, not heavy with weakness, but dense and weighted. Victoria felt uncomfortable. She was used to making decisions, suggestions, and everything being adjusted according to her will. Her daughter's silence unsettled her in a way boardrooms never had. Graves pulled out his notebook and began to write. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was very clear in the quiet room. "Increase control, reduce stimulation, limit outside contact." He looked up at Victoria. "This is necessary to protect the process." Isloaded, Victoria nodded. Even though a vague sense of instability rose within her, she stood up and looked at Sophia once more. "I'll be back," she said, as if those words were enough to maintain a connection that was slipping from her grasp. When Victoria left, Graves signaled to the assistant. The door to the room was closed, and then the sound of a lock came from outside. Dry, decisive. Sophia sat still and heard it clearly. The room became quiet in a different way. No more analytical voices, no more evaluating gazes. Sophia lifted her head for the first time since being brought here. She looked around the room. Each familiar detail suddenly felt distant. Everything was clean, orderly, and signed for control. And it was precisely in that space that Sophia clearly sensed the only freedom she had left. She remembered Marcus's hands. The way he signed was slow and steady. The sentence he had left her with before being dragged away. "I am not invisible." That memory was not loud, but it was clearer than any explanation the adults had given her. Outside, in another room, Victoria stood beside Graves. She looked through the one-way glass at Sophia sitting motionless on the bed. "She'll be okay, right?" Victoria asked, her voice lower. Graves replied immediately, without hesitation. "This is a short-term reaction. Once the disruptive factor is removed, everything will return to its trajectory." He paused, then added, "You handled it correctly. Early control is always better than letting things get out of hand." Victoria nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the image of her daughter. Sophia was not crying, not struggling, not begging. She sat there, like an unreadable block of stillness. That unsettled Victoria in a way she did not want to admit. Inside the room, Sophia shifted her position. She sat up straighter, her back no longer resting against the headboard. Her hands lay on her thighs, her fingers curling slightly, then relaxing. She lifted her hand, then lowered it again, as if reminding herself of a decision that had just been made. This silence was not merely the result of coercion, it was a choice. She remembered Marcus's face when he looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, just looking and waiting for her to respond. In this room, no one was waiting for that. They were waiting for reactions to adjust, for signs to label. Sophia understood that more clearly than they realized. Outside, Graves continued making notes. "No response to signing, no cooperation with therapy, recommend increased monitoring frequency." He spoke as if reading a checklist, unaware that every word being written was another layer of chains. Victoria listened and nodded out of habit, but when she looked back through the glass, she noticed something different. Sophia did not resemble the children she had seen in reports, not frightened, not disoriented. Her eyes were sharp and focused, as if holding tightly to something inside. "How long before she reacts?" Victoria asked. Graves smiled faintly. "When she realizes that silence no longer brings benefits." That answer lingered in Victoria's mind longer than she would have liked. She turned away and left the observation area. She needed to believe everything was being handled correctly, to believe control was love, to believe this system knew what was best. Inside the room, Sophia lay down on the bed, turning her face toward the wall. She did not sleep. She listened to every small sound outside, every passing footstep, every door opening and closing. Each sound confirmed that she was being separated from the world in a very orderly way. Sophia closed her eyes, then opened them. She was not afraid. Fear had been replaced by something else, clearer and sharper. She understood that if she spoke, they would continue to speak for her. If she reacted, they would assign her another name. Silence was the only thing they had not taken. The door locked from the outside, keeping Sophia in the room. But within that locked space, she sat with her back straight, her eyes more resolute than ever. This silence had not made noise yet. It had not frightened anyone yet, but it had begun to accumulate, like a quiet pressure, ready to break the things that seemed the most solid. And that was only the beginning. The meeting room of the Harlan household was bright and quiet, in a way that made it easy to believe every decision made there was reasonable. The lighting was soft, the long table pristine, the chairs neatly arranged. On the table in front of Graves lay a thick file, carefully clipped together, each page perfectly flat, as if it had never touched a real child of flesh and blood. He stood at the head of the table, flipped open the first page, his voice even and firm, like he was delivering a business report. "Poor progress," Graves said without looking up. "ASL, or any assistive communication technology, is not recommended at this time." Victoria sat across from him, her hands clasped together. She frowned, but earlier, she responded very well. Graves looked up, his gaze steady and unmoving. That was an illusion of progress, caused by stimulation from an incorrect source. Victoria repeated slowly, as if to hear it more clearly herself. "Which sour?" "E." Graves answered immediately, without hesitation. "The repairman. Uncontrolled factors." The answer was delivered lightly, yet it was enough to erase every moment in which Victoria had seen her daughter's smile. An advisor seated beside her leaned forward, his voice low, carrying a familiar practicality. "Maintaining the family's image is more important. Everything else can be handled later." Victoria remained silent. She looked down at the file in front of her, the cold lines of text gradually replacing the vivid memories of Sophia. Graves continued, pointing to a chart. "At present, limiting communication will help stabilize behavior. Any method that encourages proactive expression is inappropriate." "Inappropriate," Victoria echoed, her voice softer. "Inappropriate," Graves confirmed, then closed the file with a decisive motion. "We need to remain firm." In another corridor, Sophia was led into the therapy room. This room was smaller, emptier, designed to eliminate anything deemed distracting. A woman in medical attire pointed to the chair placed in the center of the room. "Sit here." Sophia complied. She looked around, her eyes slowly scanning the bare walls. A nurse stood behind her, bent down to her eye level, her voice gentle but rigid. "Watch my lips. We're going to practice lip reading." End quote. Sophia looked up, then turned her face away. The movement was decisive, without hesitation. Her hands rested still on her lap. No signing, no response. The nurse let out a small breath and turned to a colleague, whispering, "She's really stubborn." Graves entered the observation room behind the glass. He watched Sophia the way one would observe a variable that needed to be controlled. "Begin." "Is a robbling." The therapist spoke slowly, exaggerating her mouth movements as if addressing someone without the right to choose. Sophia watched her lips for a few seconds, then her gaze drifted elsewhere. Her silence was not loud, but it was enough to unsettle the adults. "You need to cooperate," the therapist said, her patience beginning to thin. Sophia continued to turn away. In her mind appeared Marcus's hands, the way he waited for her to respond. No one here was waiting for that. They were waiting for compliance. Graves took notes. Non-compliance with therapy. Recommend increased supervision. Victoria stood behind him, watching through the glass. She saw her daughter sitting still, far smaller than the room around her. A wave of discomfort rose within her, but she pushed it down. Graves turned to her. "You see, we can't let emotions interfere." Victoria nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Sophia. "How long until she shows improvement?" "When all disruptive factors are completely removed," Graves replied, "and when she understands that resistance brings no benefit." The words passed through Victoria, leaving behind a cold aftertaste. She turned away and stepped out of the observation room. In the hallway, an advisor caught up with her. "We need to control the narrative. The media is very sensitive to cases like this." Victoria nodded. "I understand." Abeda. Inside the therapy room, Sophia was escorted out. She walked slowly, her eyes meeting no one's. When the door closed, she stood still for a moment, then clenched her hands. Her fingers curled inward, nails pressing into her palms, but she did not sigh, did not cry, did not react in the way the adults expected. Graves returned to the meeting room. He opened the file again and flipped to the final page. A pen was drawn, dark blue ink. He reread the concluding line, as if to ensure there was no error. Permanent, limited, prognosis. The pen touched the paper, drawing a firm, decisive line. The signature was completed, neat and without hesitation. To Graves, it was a procedure, a reasonable decision based on data. In the corner of the therapy room, Sophia sat down on a chair. She stared into the space ahead of her. Her hands remained clenched, then slowly loosened. No one witnessed that moment, but it existed clearly. Something was building, silently, heavier than a scream. Outside, Victoria held a copy of the report. She reread the lines, trying to convince herself this was the right path. But in her mind, the image of Sophia smiling in the banquet hall kept returning, refusing to disappear. She folded the report and placed it on the table, as if not looking at it would make it less real. Graves stood across from her, his voice firm. "We've done everything necessary." Victoria looked at him. "Are you sure?" Graves nodded. "Absolutely." 1. That answer closed the conversation, but it did not close what was unfolding in the small room down the hallway. Sophia lifted her head, her eyes no longer empty. They were focused, cold, and clear. She understood that they had decided for her, and she had just decided on her own. This silence was not a disappearance, it was an accumulation. And when it accumulates long enough, deep enough, it will find a way to shatter everything built upon those immaculate pages of paper. Morning at the Harlan Group headquarters began with tense faces. Victoria's familiar boardroom no longer carried its usual air of control. A communications advisor stood beside the large screen, his voice low but urgent. "The media can smell blood. Some financial blogs are starting to talk about instability within the family." Victoria set the file folder down on the table harder than necessary. "I pay you to fix it, not to list problems." The advisor fell silent and stepped back half a step. Graves sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped together, his demeanor calm. "Everything is still under control. The child just needs time. Reactions like this are not uncommon." Victoria did not look at Graves right away. She stared at the screen, where the stock chart had just ticked downward in an unsettling way. "Time is not something the market gives us." Graves smiled faintly. "The market does not need details. It only needs a stable story." The meeting ended faster than usual. Victoria stood up, leaving the reassurances behind. She walked into the corridor and headed straight toward the internal security area. "Open the camera in Sophia's room," she said to the attendant. The screen lit up. Sophia sat on the chair, motionless. Time passed in the corner of the screen, minute by minute, hour by hour. She did not sign, did not turn her head, did not change posture. Victoria watched, her chest tightening. She had never seen a silence last this long without carrying the shape of weakness. Graves stepped closer and stood beside her. "This is an adaptive response. When stimulation is removed, behavior adjusts." Victoria did not take her eyes off the screen. "What if you are wrong?" The question fell slowly, carrying no anger, but something else, more fragile. Graves tilted his head slightly and gave a thin smile. "I am never wrong, especially with children like that. I have a goes." That answer made Victoria turn to look at him for the first time that morning. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to find a crack in that certainty. But Graves maintained his familiar composure. Victoria turned back to the screen. Sophia was still sitting there, her gaze neither empty nor tired. It looked like a gaze that was waiting, not waiting for rescue, but waiting for something forced to reveal itself. She remembered the moment in the banquet hall when Sophia smiled, a smile that was not neat, not beautiful by the standards of the Harlan family image, but real. And she remembered the man kneeling in front of her child, his voice low and steady. The only person there who knew how to speak to her daughter. Victoria left the camera room and returned to her private office. The door closed, completely soundproof. For the first time in many years, she did not call her assistant, did not call an advisor. She sat down and opened her personal computer. Her hand hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds. The repairman that day? What was his name? The question echoed in her mind, repeating like a scratch that refused to heal. Victoria began searching. Not through official systems, not notifying anyone, just scattered keywords pieced together. Electrical and plumbing repair, labor district, Harlan Gala. A name appeared after a few minutes. Marcus Jackson. Victoria read slowly, word by word. A file so thin it was almost non-existent. No awards, no achievements, no notable connections. A man living on the edge of all the systems she controlled. She looked back at the camera screen once more. Sophia was still sitting there. There was no collapse, as Graves had predicted. Only an unsettling stillness. The office door opened. Graves walked in, his voice maintaining its usual rhythm. "You need me to sign additional approvals for the communications plan." Victoria did not turn around immediately. "How many times have you met Marcus Jackson?" Graves paused slightly. "Very briefly. I have not met him. A nobody. Not worth remembering." Victoria turned her chair and looked directly at Graves. "You remember him clearly enough to call him an uncontrolled factor?" Graves remained silent for a beat, then replied, "You are letting emotions interfere." Victoria stood up. She was slightly taller than Graves when standing this close. "I am looking at results. My child has been sitting still for hours. My stock is starting to shake. And you are telling me everything is fine." Graves pressed his lips together. "This is a necessary phase." Victoria turned her back and walked toward the window. Below lay the city she was accustomed to dominating with numbers. "Do you know what is most dangerous to power?" she asked, her voice low. "Not chaos, but a silence that refuses to explain itself." Graves did not answer. Victoria turned back, her voice firmer. "Suspend all new reports. I want to review the original files." "You are breaking protocol," Graves said. "I am doing the job of a mother," Victoria replied, using that word in this room for the first time. Graves looked at her, his expression shifting slightly. "You are putting the system at risk." Victoria smiled faintly. "Your system has put my child at risk." The exchange ended there. Victoria did not argue further. She returned to her desk and looked at the name Marcus Jackson on the screen. A name the entire banquet hall had once treated like a stain had now become the only anchor for a question she could no longer push aside. She stood up and walked quickly out of the office. "Prepare the car." The assistant looked up, surprised. "Ma'am, this afternoon's schedule." "Cancel it," Victoria cut in. "I have something else to do." She walked away without looking back. In the corridor, the sound of her heels was decisive, unlike the hesitation of the morning. For the first time in many years, Victoria Harlan was not following expert advice, nor relying on protocol. She was following an instinct she had learned to ignore. In the private room, Sophia was still sitting there. She did not know what her mother was doing, but her gaze did not change. It was patient, as if she had already chosen her strategy. Victoria stopped in front of her daughter's door and placed her hand on the handle. She did not open it right away. She looked through the glass and looked at Sophia one more time. Then she turned away, a decision she had never made in her life as a chief executive officer, beginning to take clear shape. If you have ever seen an expert use power to silence the truth, follow and comment, "Who is the manipulator?" Because next, Victoria will do something the entire elite world considers a humiliation. The luxury car slowed as it turned into the old working-class neighborhood, where rows of low houses were packed closely together, the road surface mottled and cracked, and electrical wires tangled overhead. The smooth hum of the engine sounded out of place in the dusty afternoon. Marcus was fixing a water faucet in the front yard when he looked up. He wiped his hands on an old cloth and watched as the car came to a full stop in front of his house. A faint smile flickered across his lips. "First time you've come here." Victoria Harlan opened the car door. She stood straight, her eyes sweeping quickly over the street as a professional reflex, then settling on Marcus. There were no bodyguards beside her, no advisors following behind. She spoke directly, without preamble. "I need you." Marcus leaned back against the step, his voice cool and clear. "No, you need your daughter to be heard." The answer made Victoria pause for a brief beat. She looked at Marcus, this time not with the assessing gaze of a chief executive officer in a banquet hall, but with the look of someone forced to negotiate outside her comfort zone. "I came here to talk." "We're already talking." Marcus replied, "and I don't owe you anything." The front door opened, and Liam peeked out. He saw the stranger, then looked at his father. Marcus gave a slight nod. Liam stepped out another pace, raised both hands, and signed a polite greeting. Victoria looked at those hands, then at Liam's face, confusion clearly visible. Her lips parted, but no gesture followed in response. That silence revealed an awkwardness no boardroom had ever forced her to confront. Marcus looked straight at Victoria. "That's what exclusion feels like. Familiar yet?" Victoria drew a deep breath. "I understand the message." She paused for a moment, then continued, lowering her voice. "I want you to come see Sophia." Marcus did not answer right away. He looked at Liam, then back at Victoria. The silence stretched long enough to make the boundary unmistakable. "If that doctor is still there, I won't step inside." Victoria nodded a short, decisive nod. No conditions attached, no explanation offered. It was a nod rarely given to people from Marcus's world, and she knew it. He won't be there. Marcus looked at her once more, as if weighing her words not only with his ears, but with memory itself. He nodded slightly, then bent down to Liam's level. "Go get your jacket." Liam turned back inside. Victoria remained still, looking around the neighborhood. She saw children playing at the end of the alley, their laughter uneven and scattered. A neighbor glanced at her curiously, then turned away. No one approached. No one asked who she was. The sensation unsettled Victoria in an entirely new way. Marcus stepped into the house and closed the door. Inside, he sat down in front of Liam. "You heard everything," Liam signed. "They want you to go back." Marcus nodded. "Because of Sophia." Liam hesitated. "Are you going?" Marcus looked at his son. "I'll go, if you come with me." Liam's eyes widened, then hesitated quickly. "I'm coming too." Marcus smiled very slightly. "Then, we're going." When they stepped back outside, Victoria had already opened the rear door of the car. Marcus paused for a second, looked inside, then took Liam's hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried a clear decision. He got into the car and sat across from Victoria. The space between them was quiet, no longer confrontational as it had been at the beginning. The car pulled away. Through the window, the working-class neighborhood receded behind them, giving way to wider roads. Victoria spoke first, her voice low. "I was wrong to let things happen that way." Marcus did not look at her. "You were wrong to believe you could speak about your daughter without listening to her." Victoria nodded slightly. "I'm learning that." Liam looked at both of them, then signed to Victoria. "Hello." Victoria watched the gesture and slowly responded with an awkward, mistimed movement. Liam laughed and corrected her. Marcus observed, without intervening. He let Victoria experience her own slowness in what seemed like a very small conversation. "Thank you," Victoria said, unsure whether Liam could read her lips. Liam nodded. The car entered the mansion district. The gates opened, revealing a long, stone-paved driveway. Marcus watched the scenery pass by without curiosity or visible unease. When the car stopped, he took Liam's hand and stepped out. Victoria walked ahead, leading them inside. Inside, the space was far quieter than before. There was no music, no guests. A few staff members stood at a distance, their gazes discreet. Victoria stopped and turned to Marcus. "We'll meet Sophia in the common room." Marcus nodded. "I want to talk to her." No notes, no one watching from behind glass. Victoria answered immediately. Agreed. They entered the room. Sophia was sitting in a chair near the window. When she saw Marcus, she looked up. Her expression changed at once, as if recognizing a familiar signal. Marcus knelt, keeping just enough distance. Liam stood beside him. Marcus signed, "Hello," is another body. Sophia responded, slowly but firmly, "Hello." Victoria stepped back and observed. No one spoke, no one interrupted, only hands moving and eyes meeting. Sophia looked at Liam, then sighed. "Who are you?" Liam signed back. "I'm Liam." Sophia smiled a small smile, but entirely different from the emptiness of the previous days. Victoria stood still, her hands clasped tightly together. She was witnessing something no report could capture. Marcus turned to Victoria. "You see it now, is pot?" Victoria nodded. "I see it." Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Victoria turned and raised her hand to signal a stop. "No one comes in." The room returned to silence. Marcus signed a few more sentences to Sophia, asking whether she wanted water, whether she was tired. Sophia answered each one. Liam sat down on the floor, listening, occasionally adding a small gesture of his own. Victoria stood there, feeling her pride peel away layer by layer. She spoke softly. "I left her alone for too long. Marcus did not answer immediately. You still have time. Victoria looked at him. Will you stay? Marcus looked at Sophia, then at Liam. I stay when the children need me. The answer was not a negotiation. Victoria understood that. She nodded and stepped back another pace, yielding space to those speaking in a language she had only just begun to relearn from the beginning. When they left the room, Marcus held Liam's hand. The boy signed, his eyes anxious. Dad, will they hurt you? Marcus bent down and signed back, slowly and clearly. This time, Dad isn't going alone. The door closed behind them. Inside, Victoria stood watching through the glass, not to control, but to learn how to wait. The living room of the Harlan estate sank into a kind of quiet, unlike the days before. It was not an imposed silence, but one of waiting. Sophia sat near the window, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze directed toward the garden. When the door opened and Marcus stepped in with Liam, the child turned her head. Sophia's expression changed instantly. No one needed to say her name. No introduction was required. Recognition happened in an instant. Her eyes lit up so clearly that no one in the room could deny it. Marcus knelt, keeping the familiar distance. He raised his hands and signed gently, without haste. Hello, Sophia. Sophia responded almost immediately. Her hands moved smoothly and coherently, carrying emotion that was not restrained at all. Hello, Marcus. A smile appeared, no longer cautious, no longer checking the reactions of the adults around her. She was communicating in the true sense of the word. Liam stood beside her, leaning slightly toward Sophia. The two children looked at each other, then began to sign together. Simple sentences, clumsy gestures, but full of enthusiasm. No one guided them, no one corrected them. Laughter burst out, without needing perfectly formed sounds, yet so vivid that the room itself seemed to expand. Victoria stood behind them, her hand unconsciously gripping the back of a chair. She watched the scene before her, as if witnessing something that shattered the entire logic she had built over many years. In just one day, the child whom reports had labeled permanently limited was communicating, laughing, and was unmistakably present. Why? Victoria spoke up, her voice growing hoarse. In just one day? Marcus did not turn back immediately. He watched Sophia and Liam a little longer, to be sure the moment was not interrupted. Then he stood up and turned to Victoria. Because they are treated as human beings. The answer carried no accusation, but it was enough to unsteady Victoria. She looked at her daughter, at the way Sophia initiated signing with Liam, the way she waited for a response, the way she corrected a gesture for a newly met friend. None of that appeared in any report. Sophia turned to look at her mother. She looked for a long time, as if weighing something. Then her hands rose. The movement was slow, deliberate. Mom. Just one word, but it felt like a deep crack. Victoria froze. She took one step forward, then stopped, as if afraid of breaking that fragile moment. Tears surged up, beyond her control. She raised a hand to cover her mouth, then broke down crying, a reaction no boardroom had ever allowed. Graves stood in the back, his face paling. He looked at Sophia, at Marcus, at Liam. Every argument, every term, every diagnosis became hollow before this scene. He stepped back very slightly, but enough for Victoria to notice. She spun around. Tears were still on her face, but her voice had changed. It trembled, yet it was sharp. Reevaluate everything. Graves opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since stepping into this family, he had no ready answer. He stepped back another pace, his hand tightening as he tried to stay composed. Miss Victoria, we need to be cautious. Victoria did not take her eyes off him. Caution is what you use to blind me. Graves took a deep breath. This is only a short-term reaction. Marcus cut in, his voice low. Then, what do you call months of silence? Graves turned toward Marcus, a flicker of restrained anger flashing in his eyes. You have no expertise. Marcus nodded. That's right, but I have a child. That statement ended all debate. Victoria turned back to Sophia. The girl was signing something to Liam that made them both laugh. There was no coercion, no rehearsal. Only communication. Victoria stepped closer. She knelt, this time not to command or control. She looked at Sophia, raised her hands, and signed clumsily, Mom is here. Sophia watched the movement, then gently corrected her mother. Victoria smiled through her tears, nodded, and signed again, slow and uncertain, but sincere. No one in the room spoke. Even Graves stood still, removed from the center of the story he had once monopolized. Victoria stood up and turned to Graves once more. "I want an independent counsel." Graves objected reflexively. "You cannot." "I can," Victoria replied, "and I will." Graves stepped back another pace. Control slipped from his hands, not through a loud confrontation, but through a visible truth that needed no defense. Sophia was coming alive right before their eyes. Marcus stepped back toward Liam and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He did not need to say anything more. He had done what he came here to do. Victoria looked at him, her expression entirely different from their first meeting in the reception hall. "Thank you." Marcus nodded. "Thank your daughter." Victoria turned back to Sophia. She did so. This time no one interrupted. No one took notes. There was only a mother learning how to listen, and a child speaking in her own language. Behind them, Graves stood motionless, losing control for the first time in his life, and he understood very clearly that from this moment on, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The independent audit began on a cold, quiet morning. There was no press conference, no loud declarations, only people walking into the records room with clear eyes and time on their side. Victoria Harlan sat at the end of the table, her back straight, her hands placed in front of her. She did not interrupt, did not steer. For the first time, she let others read the truth in her place. The report folder was opened, pages turned slowly, charts were stacked, timelines cross-referenced. An independent expert looked up, his voice firm. The records show that Sophia's condition was systematically exaggerated. Alternative communication options were eliminated very early. Another person continued, pointing directly at the notes. There is no medical evidence supporting the ban on American Sign Language or assistive technology. This decision was not based on the patient's best interest. The room fell silent. Victoria looked at the familiar lines of text, now distant and razor-sharp. She turned to Graves, who was sitting across from her. "What did you do to my daughter?" Graves clenched his hands, then sprang to his feet. "I protected the order. You don't understand the cost of chaos." His voice rose, breaking its rhythm. "If everyone is allowed to speak in their own way, the system will collapse." The independent expert shook his head. He did not treat, he controlled. Victoria stood up. Her gaze no longer wavered. "No, you protected profits." Graves sneered, trying to cling to authority through his voice. "You will regret this. Children like that need structure." Victoria turned away, signaling the legal team. "End it." A soft metallic sound rang out as the handcuffs were locked. Graves was led away, his eyes filled with resentment, sweeping over everyone as if searching for one last crack to cling to. There was no applause, no satisfaction, only a heavy void where a fake humanitarian empire had just collapsed under its own weight. Marcus stood outside the hallway, leaning against the wall. He did not step into the room, nor did he need an invitation. When Victoria walked out, she stopped in front of him. "Do you want to say anything?" Marcus looked through the glass, where the experts were gathering their papers. "I never needed you to believe me." Victoria nodded. "I know." End quote. In the common room, Sophia and Liam stood side by side. The two children spoke about the garden, about sunlight streaming through the window. No one asked, no one corrected. Their presence was natural and unmistakable, like a truth that needed no proof. That afternoon, Victoria held a press conference. There was no flashy backdrop. She stood alone at the microphone. "The Harlan Corporation takes responsibility for the mistakes that occurred. We will publish the full audit results and establish an independent fund called Voices Unheard, aimed at supporting deaf children from marginalized communities." A journalist asked, "Whom will you invite as an advisor?" Victoria did not hesitate. "Marcus Jackson." In the back, Marcus stood beside Liam. The boy looked at his father and signed quickly. "Are you scared?" Marcus signed back, slow and steady. "No, because we are telling the truth." That evening, the mansion was quieter. Victoria sat with Sophia in the room. She signed slowly, awkwardly, but without avoidance. "Mom is sorry." Sophia looked at her mother, then signed back. "You listen." Victoria nodded. "I listen." Outside, Marcus and Liam stood looking at the sky. The garden lights softened. Marcus did not feel victorious. He felt a necessary closure. The truth had been cruel enough to those who built power on the silence of others. The next day, articles appeared. Not all were fair. Not every system changed. But one thing was clear. When silence is used as resistance, it forces those in control to reveal themselves. Sophia and Liam sat side by side on the steps, communicating with their hands. They did not ask anyone for permission to exist. The story did not end with a trophy or a round of applause. It ended with a quiet but razor-sharp warning. This system still has many graves, and every time we choose to listen instead of label, another fake humanitarian empire gains another crack. If you believe that silence is not weakness, but resistance, follow, share, and comment, listen to them before it is too late.